The dark auction. The room smelled like rust, oil, and something else, something that reminded Jack of forgotten places. The air was thick, filled with murmurs in a dozen alien tongues. The auction house was not the kind of place anyone walked into by accident. It was a place where secrets were sold and lives were traded with cold precision. Jack sat at the far end of the room, his hat pulled low over his face. He didn't want to be noticed. Humans were rare here, and when they showed up, it usually wasn't for anything good. Jack didn't mind. He wasn't there for anything good either. The stage lights flickered. A tall, thin alien with metallic skin stepped forward. The auctioneer. His voice echoed across the room, smooth and sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, the next item is rare. One of a kind. For collectors, or those who seek something more." A glass cage rolled onto the stage. Inside stood a girl. She looked young, too young to be here. Her skin shimmered faintly under the lights, reflecting soft hues of blue and silver. Large, bright eyes stared out from under dark, tangled hair. She hugged herself, trembling, as the auctioneer began describing her origins. Jack didn't care much for the details. He had been to enough auctions to know what this was. She wasn't an item. She was a prize. "The bidding will start at 5,000 credits, the auctioneer announced. A heavy-set alien with scales like cracked stone grunted and raised his hand. Jack recognized him. A warlord from the outer systems. Nasty business. 5,000. Do I hear 6? Another alien, draped in robes that shimmered like glass, made a bid. Jack's eyes drifted back to the girl. She didn't move, but her eyes flicked nervously around the room, locking onto each bidder. There was no fight in her, only fear. 7,500. The warlord spoke again, his voice a low growl. The auctioneer smiled. "Ah, Lord Crag returns. Do I hear 8? Jack felt his fingers twitch. He didn't know why he cared. He wasn't in the business of rescuing strangers, especially not from alien warlords who wouldn't forget his face. 8,000, said the robed figure. Jack leaned forward. 10,000. The warlord snapped, his eyes narrowing. The room grew quiet. No one wanted to challenge Crag. Jack could feel the weight of the warlord's presence pressing down on everyone. Jack sighed. 15,000. Heads turned. Whispers spread like wildfire. A human had bid. The auctioneer's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Ah, an unexpected player. 15,000 from the human. Do I hear 16? Crag's cold black eyes locked onto Jack, the kind of stare that promised pain. Jack grinned slightly. 20,000. Crag growled. Jack didn't blink. 25,000. The room went dead silent. Crag stepped forward, looming over the crowd. I could tear you apart for less than that, he said quietly. Jack leaned back in his seat. You could, but then you'd lose the auction. Crag's fists tightened, but he didn't bid again. 25,000 to the human. Going once, going twice. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel struck down with a sharp crack. Jack exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. The girl's glass cage was rolled off the stage. Jack rose from his seat and walked toward the back room to finalize the deal. Crag watched him the entire way, eyes burning like coals. The girl didn't say a word as Jack approached the holding area. She sat quietly on the edge of the cage, staring at the floor. Jack crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. What's your name? She didn't answer. I'm Jack, he said casually. Congratulations, you're free now. The girl lifted her head slightly, but her expression didn't change. Jack unlocked the cage and stepped back, giving her space. She hesitated for a long moment before slowly stepping out. I'm not going to hurt you, Jack added, noticing the way she kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to snatch her back. Why? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack shrugged. I hate seeing people in cages. She stared at him, searching for something in his eyes. Then, quietly, She followed him out of the auction house and into the unknown. A risky gamble. Jack had been in trouble before. A lot of trouble. But this was different. The girl walked a step behind him as they moved through the crowded streets of the spaceport. She kept her eyes low, arms wrapped around herself like she could disappear if she just stayed small enough. Jack didn't blame her. This place was loud, dangerous, and full of shadows that watched without blinking. He glanced sideways, catching her reflection in a dirty glass panel. She looked tired, thin, and more than a little scared. "Stick close," Jack muttered without turning his head. She didn't reply, but her footsteps quickened just enough to walk beside him. Jack's mind raced. He had spent everything he had on her. All his credits, his backup funds. Hell, even his ship was now listed as collateral. If this gamble didn't pay off, he wouldn't just be broke, he'd be dead. The auction house didn't like people who bid beyond their means. Jack felt the weight of the crowd shift. Someone was watching. He didn't slow down, but he glanced at the reflection again. There in the crowd was Crag. The warlord hadn't left after the auction. He was following them. Jack cursed under his breath. "All right, kid. We need to move faster." The girl looked up, but before she could ask, Jack grabbed her hand and pulled her down a side alley. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Away from trouble. The narrow alley twisted into a maze of metal and steam. Neon signs flickered overhead, buzzing softly in alien languages Jack didn't bother to read. He knew these streets well enough to know which paths led out, and which ones were dead ends. He turned left, then right, then left again. But no matter how many corners they took, he could feel Crag behind them. Jack slowed his pace, squeezing the girl's hand slightly. "Hey," he whispered, crouching next to her. "I need you to listen carefully, okay?" She nodded, eyes wide. "We're going to split up. You take that path." He pointed to a narrow gap between two crates. "And head straight until you hit the market square. There's a red awning at the far end. Wait for me there." "What about you?" she asked quietly. Jack smiled faintly. "I'll be right behind you." She hesitated. "You can trust me," he added softly. The girl's eyes lingered on his face for a long moment before she nodded and slipped through the gap, vanishing into the crowd. Jack stood up, adjusting his jacket. He didn't have a plan. Not yet. But if Crag wanted him, fine. Let him come. He turned around slowly, leaning casually against the wall. The warlord emerged from the alley shadows, flanked by two guards, hulking brutes with armor that shimmered faintly under the neon lights. "You paid a high price for her," Crag said, his voice like grinding metal. "Too high." Jack shrugged. "Guess I have expensive taste." Crag stepped closer. His eyes narrowed. "I don't like being humiliated, human." "Then maybe you shouldn't show up to auctions you can't win," Jack replied, smiling just enough to be annoying. One of Crag's guards stepped forward, but Crag held up a hand to stop him. "She's not just a prize," Crag said quietly. "She's worth more than you realize. Far more." Jack's smile faded. "What is she?" Crag leaned in, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "A key. A weapon. A miracle, depending on whose hands she ends up in." Jack's stomach twisted. He didn't know what the girl was, but he didn't like the way Crag said it. "You should have let me win," Crag added, stepping back. "It would have been easier for both of us." Jack's fingers twitched toward the blaster strapped to his hip, but Crag wasn't making a move. "Not yet." "I'll give you a choice," Crag said. "Hand her over now, and I'll let you leave with your ship, whole and intact." Jack glanced toward the gap where the girl had disappeared. "Nah," he replied finally. "I think I'll hold on to her." Crag's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake." Jack grinned. Wouldn't be the first time. The warlord let out a slow breath and turned to leave, his guards following close behind. But Jack knew this wasn't over. As soon as Crag disappeared, Jack hurried down the alley, moving quickly toward the market square. He spotted the red awning almost immediately. And there, sitting beneath it, was the girl. She looked up as he approached. "Trouble?" she asked softly. Jack chuckled. Always. He didn't know what he had gotten himself into. But for now, the girl was safe. And that was enough. The escape and pursuit. Jack had a rule: never look back. But as he and the girl slipped into the crowded market square, he couldn't help himself. The spaceport was alive with noise and color. Vendors shouted from their stalls, selling everything from alien fruits to black market tech. Towering holograms flickered overhead, advertising distant worlds and impossible adventures. The streets pulsed with life, but to Jack, it all felt tighter than a noose. He led the girl through the crowd, keeping one hand on the blaster at his side and the other lightly touching her shoulder. She stayed close, her small frame barely visible beneath the oversized cloak he had draped over her back. "Don't stop," he whispered as they passed a row of armored mercenaries. She nodded but didn't speak. Jack could feel the weight of unseen eyes trailing them. Crag wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "We need to get to my ship," Jack muttered, scanning the docking bay entrances ahead. His heart sank. Crag's insignia, a jagged red slash, was painted across the nearest entrance. Blocked. Jack cursed under his breath and nudged the girl toward a side street. "Change of plans. We'll take the long way." She glanced at him but didn't ask why. Smart kid. The side street twisted into a dimly lit alley, narrow and damp. Pipes hissed along the walls, releasing clouds of steam that clung to their boots. Jack's footsteps echoed faintly, but something else caught his ear, the soft scrape of footsteps behind them. They weren't alone. Jack tightened his grip on the girl's shoulder, steering her faster. "How much farther?" she asked softly. "Not far," Jack lied. He risked a glance over his shoulder. A figure darted into the shadows just as Jack turned. They were being followed. Jack stopped. The girl almost bumped into him. "Stay behind me," he ordered, drawing his blaster. The alley stretched ahead like a throat, silent and empty, except for the figure standing at the other end. Tall, armored, and unmistakably one of Crag's men. "Turn back the way we came," Jack said quietly, keeping his eyes forward. They turned, only to find two more figures blocking the path. A trap. Jack exhaled slowly, lowering the blaster just enough to appear calm. "Look, fellas, I get it. Your boss is upset. But let's not make this harder than it needs to be." The lead guard stepped forward. His helmet hissed as it retracted, revealing sharp, reptilian features and cold, black eyes. "Crag doesn't forgive." Jack forced a grin. "Neither do I." Without warning, he fired. The bolt hit the nearest guard square in the chest, sending him crashing against the alley wall. The second guard lunged forward, but Jack was faster. A second shot grazed his arm, forcing him to stumble. "Run," Jack shouted, grabbing the girl's hand and pulling her forward. They raced down the alley, slipping past the fallen guard and sprinting toward the open square ahead. Behind them, more footsteps thundered, closing in fast. Jack skidded around a corner, nearly losing his balance. The docking bay loomed ahead, but Crag's guards were pouring in from every direction. Too many. Jack's eyes darted frantically. The girl tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward a stack of crates leading up to the roof. "Climb," he ordered, boosting her up. She scrambled onto the crates, moving with surprising speed for someone so small. Jack followed, pulling himself up just as the guards rounded the corner. Blaster fire erupted beneath them, scorching the crate beside Jack's foot. He winced but kept climbing, vaulting onto the rooftop just behind the girl. "Keep going," Jack urged. They ran across the rooftop, jumping between platforms and vents. The spaceport stretched below, chaotic and sprawling. Jack spotted his ship, a rusty, battered freighter, docked at the far end of the port. "There," Jack pointed. The girl followed his gaze, eyes wide. Can we make it? Jack grinned. We don't have a choice. A low roar filled the air, shaking the rooftop beneath their feet. Jack glanced over his shoulder. Craig's cruiser hovered above the spaceport, its cannon swiveling toward them. Down. Jack grabbed the girl and ducked behind a large vent as a blast erupted overhead, sending debris flying across the rooftop. Jack peeked out. Craig's ship was descending, blocking the entrance to the docking bay. Guards were already spilling out, weapons drawn. The girl tugged on Jack's sleeve. I can stop them, she whispered. Jack frowned. How? She hesitated, glancing at the approaching guards. Just trust me. Jack looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Go for it. The girl stepped forward, raising her small hands. A soft, silver glow pulsed from her fingertips, spreading outward like ripples on water. The guards slowed, confusion flickering across their faces. One by one, they dropped their weapons, their eyes clouded and distant. Jack stared. Well, that's new. The girl swayed slightly, exhaustion setting in. Jack caught her before she fell. Nice trick, he said, lifting her onto his back. Now let's get out of here. They raced toward the freighter, slipping past the dazed guards and into the ship's loading bay. Jack sealed the hatch behind them, breathing heavily. As the engines roared to life, Jack glanced at the girl, who was now curled up in the co-pilot's seat, fast asleep. Jack shook his head, chuckling softly. Kid, I don't know who you are, but I think I just hit the jackpot. The mysterious past. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, steady and familiar, like the heartbeat of an old friend. Jack sat at the controls, one hand lazily resting on the throttle as the stars stretched out beyond the viewport. The girl sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, knees drawn to her chest, gazing at the endless expanse outside. It had been hours since they escaped the spaceport, but neither of them spoke. Jack liked quiet. It gave him time to think. But the silence felt different now. Heavy, expectant. You're not from around here, are you? Jack finally asked, breaking the stillness. The girl shifted slightly, her eyes flicking toward him, but saying nothing. That was some trick you pulled back there, Jack added, his tone light but curious. Made those guards drop like flies. She didn't respond. Jack leaned back in his chair, signing. You know, if you're planning to use me as a getaway ride, the least you could do is tell me your name. She hesitated, then whispered softly, Lyra. Jack smiled faintly. Lyra, huh? Pretty name. I'm Jack. I know, she said quietly, eyes still fixed on the stars. Jack arched an eyebrow. Oh, you know, do you? She glanced at him briefly but offered nothing more. Jack studied her carefully. Her skin shimmered faintly under the soft light of the cockpit, a trait he'd never seen before. Most aliens he encountered were loud, boisterous types, but Lyra was different. There was something fragile about her, like a bird that had spent too long in a cage. Jack exhaled slowly. Look, I'm not in the habit of asking too many questions, but you're not exactly blending in. Warlords don't just chase down kids for fun. What's your story? Lyra's fingers tightened around her knees. For a long moment, Jack thought she might stay silent. But then she spoke, her voice barely louder than a breath. My people, we used to live on a world called Velronis, she began, her words slow and deliberate. A long time ago, before the wars. Jack frowned. He had heard of Velronis, a dead planet, wiped clean during one of the many border conflicts. Lyra's eyes lowered. There aren't many of us left now. Most were taken, or worse. Jack's grip on the controls tightened. Taken? By who? She hesitated, and for a moment, Jack thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered a single name. Crag. Jack cursed under his breath. Of course it was Crag. Lyra glanced at him nervously. I didn't mean to drag you into this. I didn't think anyone would bid for me. Jack chuckled softly. Yeah, well, I have a bad habit of sticking my nose where it doesn't belong. Lyra's expression softened just slightly, but there was still a shadow in her eyes. They were after me because of what I can do, she said. My people, we can heal. Not just wounds, but sickness, poison, anything. That's why they hunt us. We're valuable. Jack's gaze lingered on her hands, the same hands that had stopped Crag's guards without lifting a weapon. That explains the price tag, Jack muttered. He expected her to bristle at the comment, but Lyra only nodded. I wasn't supposed to be at that auction, she added. I was trying to escape when they caught me. They kept me in that cage for weeks. I thought. Her voice trailed off. Jack waited, but she didn't finish. He didn't need her to. He'd seen enough prisoners in his time to know how the story went. Well, you're out now, Jack said, offering a faint grin. And as far as I'm concerned, you're free to go wherever you want. Lyra blinked, surprised. You're just letting me go, Jack shrugged. Not much point keeping you here if you don't want to stay. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. No one's ever said that before, she admitted softly. Jack's smile faded. Well, maybe you've been around the wrong people. Lyra turned her gaze back to the stars, but there was something different in her posture now, less tense, more at ease. You could drop me off at the next planet, she suggested. Jack tapped the navigation screen. I could, but something tells me Crag's not going to stop looking. Lyra's shoulders sank. I know, she whispered. Jack studied her closely. She was trying to be brave, but the weight she carried was obvious. You got any family left? Jack asked gently. She shook her head. Friends? No. Jack exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, that makes two of us. Lyra looked at him curiously. No family? She asked. Jack grinned faintly. Not the kind worth mentioning. For a while, neither of them spoke. The ship hummed quietly as the stars drifted by. Finally, Jack leaned forward and set a course. There's a planet a few systems over. Quiet place. Good people. They take in strays like us. Could be a safe spot until we figure out the next move. Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You're really not afraid of Crag? She asked. Jack chuckled softly. Oh, I'm terrified. But I figure I've outrun him once. I can do it again. Lyra smiled faintly, the first real smile Jack had seen from her. Okay, she said quietly. I'll trust you. Jack nodded. Smart choice, kid. Real smart choice. The warlord returns. The stars drifted lazily outside the viewport, but Jack's eyes weren't on the horizon. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the side of his seat, a nervous habit he'd picked up after too many close calls. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's chair, quietly watching him. She hadn't said much since they'd left the last system. Jack figured she was still processing everything. Hell, he was still processing everything. You sure about this planet? Lyra asked finally, breaking the silence. Jack glanced over at her, his usual cocky grin flickering for a second. Yeah, safe place. I know a guy. He helps people disappear. Lyra didn't look convinced. Jack stretched, leaning back in his seat. Look, kid, you can relax. No one's gonna find us out here. As if the universe had been waiting for those exact words, the ship's proximity alarms wailed to life. Jack shot forward, his hands flying across the console. What the hell? Out of the void, a massive cruiser materialized, blocking their path like a wall of steel. Jack's heart sank. He didn't need to see the insignia to know who it belonged to. Crag. Lyra's knuckles whitened as she gripped the armrests. He found us. Jack clenched his jaw. Yeah. Looks like he brought the whole damn party. Crag's voice crackled through the comms, low and gravelly. Thought you could run, human. Jack didn't answer. He flicked a switch, cutting the incoming transmission. Lyra's gaze darted toward him. What now? Jack forced a grin. Now we improvise. He pulled the freighter into a hard dive, skimming along the edge of the cruiser's hull. Turrets swiveled in their direction, and Jack barely had time to throw the ship into a barrel roll before bolts of plasma lit up the dark like fireworks. The ship groaned in protest as Jack yanked it sideways, threading through the cruiser's outer defenses. "Hold on," Jack shouted as the freighter dipped dangerously close to the cruiser's surface. Lyra clung to the seat, wide-eyed. "You're going to get us killed." "Better than letting Crag do it," Jack shot back. The cruiser's smaller fighters peeled away, breaking formation to pursue them. Jack's freighter was fast, but not fast enough. The engines sputtered under the strain. "They're gaining on us," Lyra warned. Jack gritted his teeth. "I see it." A targeting alarm blared. Jack cursed. One of the fighters locked onto them, charging its forward cannons. Before Jack could react, Lyra stood up. "What are you doing?" Jack barked, glancing at her. "I can stop them," she said quietly, stepping toward the viewport. Jack blinked. "Stop them how?" Lyra raised her hands, and Jack's stomach twisted with the realization she wasn't bluffing. A soft, silver glow flickered to life in her palms. The air inside the cockpit shimmered faintly, as if bending to her will. Jack's voice dropped. Hey, hold on. You don't have to." But it was too late. The glow expanded outward, seeping through the ship's walls and stretching toward the approaching fighters. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the pursuing ships stopped. Jack's eyes widened. The fighters drifted lazily, their weapons powering down, as if the pilots had fallen asleep at the controls. Lyra collapsed back into her seat, breathing heavily. Jack didn't know what to say. He pulled the freighter up, speeding away from the immobilized ships. "You?" Jack started, struggling for words. "You just..." Lyra leaned her head against the window, exhaustion plain on her face. "I told you. I can stop them." Jack glanced at the comms panel. Crag's cruiser was still behind them, but it hadn't moved. Jack knew Crag was watching, waiting. The warlord wouldn't take this lightly. "You okay?" Jack asked, his voice softer now. Lyra nodded weakly. "I'll be fine. Just tired." Jack exhaled. He didn't understand how her powers worked, but he wasn't about to complain. "You bought us some time," Jack said, checking the scanners. "That's more than I could have asked for." Lyra's eyes drifted closed. "I couldn't let them take you too." Jack froze. He stared at her for a long moment, but Lyra had already drifted into a light sleep. For the first time in years, Jack felt something strange, and not in his chest that wasn't fear or adrenaline. It was protectiveness. Jack adjusted their course, setting the freighter toward the planet he promised. Crag wasn't done. Jack knew that much, but for now, Lyra was safe, and Jack wasn't about to let anyone, not even Crag, take that away. A new home. The freighter touched down gently on the surface of the planet, settling into the soft amber soil with a low hum. Jack powered down the engines, listening as the ship's systems hissed to a halt. The air outside was still and warm, the twin suns dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky plains. Lyra stirred in the co-pilot's seat, rubbing her eyes. "Is this the place?" she asked, her voice heavy with sleep. Jack glanced out the viewport. In the distance, nestled at the base of jagged cliffs, lay a small settlement. Low-domed buildings clustered together like seashells, their windows glowing faintly in the twilight. Smoke drifted lazily from a few chimneys, and faint voices echoed on the wind. "Yeah," Jack said, unbuckling his harness. "This is it. Safe enough for now." Lyra sat up straighter, peering out the window. "It's smaller than I thought." Jack grinned. "Well, you're not exactly staying at a luxury resort." He stood and grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. Lyra followed him down the loading ramp, her bare feet padding lightly against the cool metal. As they stepped onto the soft ground, she hesitated, looking back at the ship. "You sure it's safe here?" she asked. Jack stuffed his hands into his pockets, glancing at the settlement. "Safer than most places. I know someone who runs things down there. He owes me a favor." Lyra didn't move. Her eyes traced the horizon nervously. Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the same tightness she carried since the auction. "Relax," Jack said gently. "No one's coming after you here." Lyra gave a small nod, but she didn't look convinced. The walk to the settlement was quiet, the only sound coming from the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. As they approached the entrance, a gate creaked open and a figure stepped out. A stocky man with graying hair and a mechanical arm that gleamed under the fading light. "Well, I'll be damned," the man called out, a grin spreading across his face. "Jack Harper, back from the dead." Jack smirked. "You know me, Quinn. Can't stay buried for long." Quinn's eyes shifted to Lyra, his grin fading slightly. "Who's the kid?" Jack rested a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "This is Lyra. She's special." Quinn raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Any trouble following you?" "Always," Jack replied. Quinn snorted. "Figures. Come on, I'll get you two settled." The settlement was simple, small homes made from salvaged metal and stone, with narrow pathways winding between them. People watched curiously as Jack and Lyra passed, but no one stopped them. Quinn led them to a modest house near the edge of the village. The structure was plain, with a rounded roof and walls lined with old solar panels. "It's not much," Quinn said, unlocking the door with a flick of his mechanical fingers. "But it'll keep you out of sight." Jack stepped inside, scanning the small room. A few worn-out chairs sat around a table, and a bunk was tucked away in the corner. Lyra lingered at the doorway, staring out into the settlement. "You'll be safe here," Quinn said to her, his tone softening. "This place, it's for people like you." Lyra glanced at him. "People like me?" "People with nowhere else to go," Quinn replied. Jack dropped his bag onto the floor and turned to Quinn. "Appreciate this. I'll make it up to you." Quinn waved a hand dismissively. "You've done enough for me, Jack. Consider it payback." Lyra wandered to the small window, peering out at the distant cliffs. Jack could see the wheels turning in her head. She wasn't sure if she belonged here. Later that evening, Jack found Lyra sitting outside on the steps of the house, her gaze fixed on the night sky. The stars stretched endlessly above, brighter and closer than Jack had ever seen them. "You thinking about leaving?" Jack asked, leaning against the railing. Lyra didn't look at him. "I don't know. This place feels strange." Jack sat beside her, stretching his legs out. "Strange can be good. Better than cages and warlords. Right?" She nodded but remained quiet. Jack exhaled slowly, staring at the stars. "I get it, you know. Feeling out of place." Lyra glanced at him. "You do." Jack smirked. "I wasn't always a smuggler. Used to have a crew. A home. Lost it all when I crossed the wrong people." Lyra's eyes softened. "What happened?" Jack shrugged. "Same thing that happens to everyone. Someone bigger, meaner came along and took it." Lyra looked down at her hands, her fingers glowing faintly in the dark. "I keep wondering if Crag will come here. If he'll try again." "He might," Jack admitted. "But you're not alone this time." Lyra finally met his gaze, and for the first time, Jack saw something other than fear, hope. "You'll stay?" she asked quietly. Jack grinned. "I think I will. Someone's got to keep an eye on you." Lyra smiled faintly, leaning her head against the railing. "Thanks, Jack." Jack stared at the sky, his grin fading into something softer. For the first time in years, Jack Harper felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The final gamble. The days passed quietly in the small settlement beneath the cliffs. Jack almost forgot what peace felt like. It was strange, too quiet at times. But he wasn't complaining. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder every hour. Lyra adapted quicker than Jack expected. She spent her days exploring the settlement, helping with small repairs, and even making a few friends among the other refugees. The other kids were drawn to her, curious about the strange shimmer in her skin and the soft glow that followed her fingertips at night. Jack watched from a distance, arms crossed as he leaned against Quinn's workshop. "She fits in," Quinn said, stepping beside him. His mechanical arm whirred softly as he handed Jack a cup of hot caf. Jack nodded, taking a slow sip. "Yeah, she's tougher than she looks." Quinn chuckled. "Reminds me of someone else I know." Jack smirked but didn't reply. That night, as the settlement settled into quiet slumber, Jack found Lyra sitting by the cliffside, her legs dangling over the edge. "Couldn't sleep?" Jack asked, sitting beside her. Lyra shook her head. "I like it out here. The stars feel closer." Jack gazed up at the endless stretch of sky. "Yeah, that's why I got into flying. I wanted to see how far I could go." Lyra was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" Jack's breath caught for a second. He wasn't expecting the question, but he should have. "I thought about it," Jack admitted. "I'm not great at staying in one place." Lyra pulled her knees to her chest, staring at the distant horizon. "I knew you would." Jack glanced at her. "But I'm still here, aren't I?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "For now." Jack sighed. "Look, kid, I'm not gonna lie. I wasn't planning to stick around. But things change." Lyra's eyes softened. "Because of Crag?" Jack hesitated. "Yeah, partly. I don't like leaving unfinished business, but it's more than that." Lyra waited. Jack shifted, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You remind me of someone. My sister." Lyra blinked in surprise. "She was like you. Quiet. Tough. Always thought she could handle everything on her own." Jack continued, his voice distant. "I wasn't there when she needed me most." Lyra didn't press for more, but Jack could feel the weight of her gaze. "So," Jack added, cracking a faint smile, "I guess I'm sticking around for a little longer." Lyra smiled softly. But peace never lasted long in Jack's world. The attack came without warning. The first explosion rocked the settlement just after dawn, tearing through one of the outer watchtowers. Jack woke instantly, throwing on his jacket and grabbing his blaster as he sprinted outside. Smoke rose from the edge of the cliffs, and distant figures moved in the shadows. "Crag," Jack muttered. Lyra emerged from the house, eyes wide. "What's happening?" "Get inside," Jack ordered. "Now." She hesitated. "Jack." "No arguments." He snapped, his eyes hard. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me or Quinn." Lyra's hands trembled, but she nodded and darted back inside. Jack stormed toward the edge of the settlement, where Quinn was barking orders to a group of settlers armed with outdated blasters. "Is this all we've got?" Jack growled. Quinn gritted his teeth. "Crag's men must have followed your trail after all." Jack cursed. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. A sleek black ship descended overhead, its cannons charging. Jack recognized it instantly. Crag's personal cruiser. "He's here," Jack muttered. The settlers scrambled for cover as the first wave of mercenaries poured over the ridge. Jack took position behind a stack of crates, firing precise shots into the advancing line. Despite the odds, Jack fought with grim determination. But he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to buy Lyra time. The mercenaries pushed forward, overwhelming the defenders. Jack could see Crag's towering silhouette in the distance, watching from the edge of the cliff, like a predator waiting to pounce. And then Jack heard it. A low hum, soft at first, but growing. Lyra stepped out of the house. Her eyes glowed faintly in the morning light, and Jack saw something shift in the air around her. "Lyra, get back inside," Jack shouted. But she didn't stop. She walked forward, raising her hands. The ground trembled faintly beneath her feet, and the mercenaries slowed, their weapons lowering, as if something unseen pressed down on them. Crag stepped forward, eyes narrowing. So that's the power you've been hiding. Lyra's voice was calm, but it carried through the entire settlement. Leave, or I'll make you. Jack's pulse raced. He had seen what she could do to small groups. But this was different. The air shimmered like a heatwave, and suddenly the mercenaries began dropping their weapons, backing away as fear crept into their eyes. Crag's jaw tightened. You think I fear you, little girl? Lyra didn't answer. Jack rose to his feet, leveling his blaster at Crag. She gave you a chance. Walk away. For a long, tense moment, Crag said nothing. Then, with a low growl, he signaled to his remaining men. The mercenaries retreated, disappearing over the ridge. Jack exhaled, lowering his weapon. Lyra swayed, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy cloak. Jack caught her before she fell. You all right, kid? Jack asked softly. Lyra nodded weakly. I'm fine. Jack grinned. You scared him off. Lyra smiled faintly. I guess I did. Jack glanced at the rising sun, holding her steady. You did good, Lyra. Real good.